Well, good day, everyone. My name is Hozan Alan Senauke, and I am speaking to you from Berkeley, California. So welcome to the Anthropocene. This is the age in which human activity is the dominant influence on planetary geology, atmosphere, and ecology. As the Buddha famously preached, everything is burning. Burning with the fire of greed, hatred, and delusion. And now the fires are literal. In our species, craving and delusion, we set fields and forests on fire across wide swaths of the world. They're burning right now. The photo that's up on screen is an unretouched image that I took at the Berkeley Marina in California in September of 2020, a day when a hellish glow fell over the Bay Area from extensive fires to the north. The ravages of a global climate emergency are not something that's going to slowly emerge in our children or grandchildren's day. The emergency is right here now, manifesting as unprecedented heat waves, fires, drought, hurricanes, floods, rising seas, and the side effects of famine, wars, refugees, as nations and people contend for the resources and survival that are becoming increasingly scarce. As a species, humans are doing this to ourselves, a kind of mindless self-destruction driven by the three poisons. And of course, we impose this new reality on so many other species. In the end, it may be that only the cockroaches are the victors. In the first half of the 13th century of the Common Era, when our Soto Zen Buddhist ancestor Eihei Dogen was establishing his practice in Japan, the average level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was roughly 275 parts per million. When Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, my teacher's teacher in the Zen tradition, was practicing in San Francisco in 1970, the CO2 levels had reached about 325 parts per million. Today's level is 420 parts per million, a measure that's not been seen on Earth for at least 20 million years. Since 1950, fossil fuel consumption has increased eightfold, doubling just since 1980. So what does this mean? Other speakers, I'm sure, have spoken of this, but carbon dioxide is the most significant greenhouse gas, which means it absorbs heat and it traps it in the atmosphere and reflects it back widely, which raises temperatures around the globe. Without CO2, the planet would be a ball of ice. Base levels of carbon dioxide for thousands of years are naturally generated by the decomposition of organic matter, forest fires, and volcanic eruptions. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, around 1750, human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, and mass deforestation have increased these CO2 levels radically at an alarming and accelerating rate. Rising CO2 levels bring rising temperatures. And since the mid-19th century, the average rise in global temperature is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. This doesn't sound like much, but already it has given us the warmest decade in recorded history. And you can ask of people in Europe right now how they are feeling about the effects of global warming. So we have massive fires and drought, displacement of populations, unusual and extreme weather patterns, melting ice sheets, and glacial retreat, and the rising sea levels that endanger shoreline populations. And we also have ocean acidification that threatens sea life and those ecological systems. So I want to return for a moment to our Zen ancestor Dogen. When he was writing about Dana Paramita, the perfection of generosity, very poetically, he wrote, "Giving means to be not greedy. Not to be greedy means not to crave. Give flowers blooming on the distant mountains to the Tathagata." In Dogen Zenji's time, the hillsides were green and wildflowers grew freely. To give flowers blooming on the distant mountains to the Tathagata might simply mean to see and appreciate them by virtue of the Buddha nature that people, flowers, hillsides, all manifest interdependently. But if we go forward to our time, there's an ominous undertone to Dogen's expression. I think that my first glimmerings of awareness, of environmental awareness, came in the early 1970s through songs I learned about strip mining in the beautiful hills of Appalachia in the United States. Instead of old-fashioned coal mining, where people dug for coal, a new technology allowed them to dynamite and bulldoze whole mountainsides to reach seams of coal. And in the process, the ecosystems of those mountainsides were destroyed. The watersheds ran black with poison, and local communities that had lived there for many, many years were driven off the land. Flowers would never bloom again on those ravaged hillsides. And now, global warming has cooked the green hillsides brown. There's no welcoming soil in which flowers might bloom. So it takes our effort and dedication to create or to recreate the places where flowers might bloom, that we might offer them to the Buddhas. In a world that is marked by interdependence, and interdependence is another way of expressing this primary principle that Shakyamuni Buddha articulated of dependent origination. As we sit and reflect, we understand how numerous aspects of suffering that is experienced by humans and by all forms of life are interwoven in the fabric of modern life. For example, global warming leads to drought, which threatens food production around the world. As I've mentioned, the diminution of arable lands creates waves of refugees that are swelling the cities of the global south and the global north. And these growing concentrated urban populations demand increased energy supplies, which leads to the use of more fossil fuels and more power plants. These power plants are often located in poor and marginalized communities, and their output leads to chronic illness and a further degraded local environment. So we begin to see an endless chain of systemic suffering, which is linked to our use of non-renewable energies. The question that confronts us as Buddhists is the same question that confronts all people. How can we responsively, effectively act in the face of this crisis? And let me just say that I am aware that this Buddhistdoor global conference has an international audience. The reflections that I'll offer here mainly apply to my country, the United States, which also happens to be the greatest consumer, polluter, and the most prominent driver of the climate emergency. So I'm going to start locally, and in a very local and small-scale practical sense. Our Berkeley Zen Center Sangha, where I live, where I'm talking from, and our temple, we wish to align ourselves with change and with sustainability. Like many good citizens, we compost or recycle our wastes. We're dedicated to reducing water usage in our homes and gardens. And water conservation is essential in the state of California, which is in a condition of perpetual drought, which is dire because this is also one of the richest farmlands in the world. So a portion of our Zen Center's energy supply is met by a rooftop solar installation. And we hope to expand that in coming years. And we are taking steps to replace our natural gas appliances like stoves and heaters with more efficient electrical appliances, which could be powered by renewable energy. And more broadly, Berkeley Zen Center is in the process of creating a long-term plan for environmental sustainability, which would include energy usage, water conservation, waste management, and maybe most importantly, teachings that connect Buddhist wisdom and environmental literacy. So that's a small step. But as much as we need to observe best practices around energy usage, conservation, and consumer restraint, individual actions are not going to be sufficient to enact the systemic changes that we need to save our societies and our planet. I don't think we can rely just on public demonstrations. We need to buckle down and come together across communities and organize a strategic and persistent political presence. At least in the United States, as frightening as our political realities are, there's still a space, a political space that we can occupy. but the conditions are really difficult. Like much of the world, my country appears to be moving away from values of liberal democracy towards a more authoritarian future, or shall I say present. The hopes that we might have had 5 or 10 years ago for national legislation and regulation of fossil fuels seems to have evaporated. On a federal level, there's paralysis in our national legislation. In our national legislative and executive branches. And there's blockage in our highest courts, which are controlled by a conservative majority. This majority is undoing a century of progressive rulings. Only recently, the US Supreme Court moved preemptively to block a provision of the 2010 Clear Air Act, which would allow the US Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. So all of this comes at a time when, if anything, the countries that are consuming the most fossil fuels, the US, China, Russia, Europe, India, and Japan, should actually be paying reparations to the developing world for the destructive effects of our consumption on their physically and economically vulnerable peoples. Not surprisingly, this growing reparations movement as an element of environmental justice grows out of older calls for reparations compensating African Americans for the ongoing wounds of centuries of enslavement. The deeper we look, the clearer we see that these are not separate issues. All these issues are intertwined with each other. Most recently in the United States, with conservative courts, there is a long-standing stalemate in the legislative branch, particularly in the United States Senate, that blocks virtually all progressive legislation. One senator from a coal-producing state whose family wealth was built on the coal industry has the power to block the entire executive administration's clean energy program. So a national strategy for the development of necessary solar, geothermal, and wind power is essentially off the table. Much of the world looks on us as mad, and I can't blame them. Since national action is likely to be ineffective, the political field left to us, and this is still an open political field, is at the state and local levels. I can't lay out in the short time I have these legislative and administrative possibilities, and they vary from state to state in the US, and even more widely from nation to nation around the world. But it is essential to understand that building community is a necessary step for action. Organize, study, act together. Our local communities must link up with state and regional communities, and then we can weave a fabric that connects us globally. As Buddhists, we know about community. Sangha, or community, is one of our treasures. We don't have to build it from scratch. We already have it in our practice. Now the call is, first, to review the environmental practices and policies of our sanghas. Some of these may be small steps towards sustainability, like installing solar and changing out our appliances. Such simple practice develops our awareness and encourages us to participate more widely in actions and particularly in electoral and legislative campaigns that can shift the policies in our communities and states. This is how sanghas can align themselves with other communities and organizations that share these values. The effectiveness of our actions can be multiplied. Recently, a member of our Zen Center community joined the City of Berkeley's Environment and Climate Commission, which advises the City Council's plans and policies on matters of sustainability and climate change. So towards that end, the City of Berkeley is installing bike lanes and discouraging auto use, encouraging and building renewable power resources for public and private buildings, enacting a zero waste strategy for single-use foodware and other waste products. The Commission is also proposing that the city limits the development of gas stations and other fossil fuel sales points, replacing them with resources to fuel electrical and hydrogen-based vehicles. In Berkeley's public schools, the Commission is helping to create new curricula for students' climate literacy. Underlying the necessity of citizen activism is a deeper issue. We live in an industrial growth world. Profit-driven corporate capitalism and state capitalism call for constant expansion of production and markets, and the increasing extraction of labor and natural resources from every corner of the globe. Buddhist principles of a middle way of generosity, renunciation, and harmony are not part of the growth society's playbook. So long as this economic model is dominant, we are never going to address the climate crisis directly. As the accurate but tired metaphor goes, legislation and activism that leaves a growth and extraction model in place is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic as it sinks. We need new economic models based instead on Dana Paramita, on the perfection of generosity. In the midst of our more modest and narrowly directed efforts, we should keep this big picture in mind. Finally, maybe it's too late to roll back the global warming, too late to stop the melting of ice sheets, the desertification of the earth. Even if we are in the midst of what our teacher Joanna Macy calls the great unraveling, we have, as Buddhists, principles and practices to fall back on. In meditation, we learn to find a home in ourself, to locate ourself. My old teacher, Sojin Roshi, told me I should always know where my feet are. Literally, that means, where am I standing and how am I standing? And can I sense that along with everyone else, I am standing on the shoulders of ancestors who are holding us upright and steadying us to move forward? In our practice, we realize that we are not alone, either in our loss or in our modest successes. We act without depending necessarily on immediate success or failure. We act because turning towards life is the human thing to do. We have each other to rely on. Keeping this in mind, again, I look for guidance from Joanna Macy, who says, I'm doing this work so that when things fall apart, we will not turn on each other. At last, relying on Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha to steady our minds, we can act to preserve the most precious human values, regardless of whatever comes. Because it is so easy to fall into despair, we should remember that even if only 2 people remain to walk the planet, those people must rely on love and relationship and value the gifts we are given by the earth that sustain us. Thank you very much. Take good care.